Welcome to another session of lectures by Lob-EZ. I'm your host, Dr. Lob-EZ. Today's discussion, revolutions in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine, and the abolition of slavery. So the first thing we want to talk about when we discuss revolutions in Latin America is that the social class hierarchy system that existed was typically racially based. Okay, there was a class system that was part of it. So some of it was based on class, but a big section of it was also based on race. Okay. Um, so when we talk about Latin America, the first thing we're talking about is the Western Hemisphere, but everything south of what is today the United States. Okay, so that's going to include Mexico, Central America, South America, and even the Caribbean. Okay, and the reason why we say Latin is because the countries that control it are, from that make up the Romance language family. So we're talking about Spanish, Portuguese, and to a lesser degree, French. Okay, so although North America gains its freedom in the 1700s, it's going to be not until the middle of the 18 or well, they're the first part of the 1800s before liberation comes to Latin America. Okay, so as I said a moment ago, there was this hierarchy that was based on race. So it's a racial hierarchy system, and at the top, you had a group known as the Peninsulares, okay? And so this highest social class was made up of people, well, Spaniards, who were born in Spain, and then they came over. And these Peninsulares were the large landowners, and they were very wealthy, and they were kind of, the elites of Latin American society. And then just below them were what are known as the Creoles. Okay. So these are like full blooded Europeans, full blooded Spaniards, but really the only knock against them was that they were born in Latin America. So that was kind of seen as like a mark against them. And many of these Creoles were educated in European universities, and they were pretty well versed on a lot of the Enlightenment ideals. And, they were sort of considered second class citizens, and they didn't like that. And they wanted more power and prestige in Latin America, in Latin American government. And so they were going to use the, sort of philosophs' ideas of the Enlightenment, and also, what took place with the American Revolution and to the French Revolution as well, and kind of, take those ideas and use them to their advantage. Okay, so there's other groups too, the mestizos, the mulattoes. Those are people of mixed race, and so you have Caucasians mixed with the Amerindian. Those are mestizos. The mulattoes were Caucasians and African slaves that were mixed. So that mixed blood, what was again seen as like a knock, and so that put them at a lower station on that racial hierarchy. Okay, and it's going to be the Creoles that are going to lead the liberation movement all throughout, well, especially through South America. And so that's going to be kind of the thrust of what we talk about. Okay. So what ignites it, what starts it is when Napoleon is fighting the Peninsular War, when he has to go through Spain into Portugal because Portugal has violated the continental system. Okay, so if you remember that, you also know that the Spanish monarch complained about the presence of French troops in Spain, and so the result of that complaint was he was toppled by Napoleon. Okay, and so in Latin America, the Creoles took this as a sign that the monarch, the Spanish monarch, was very weak, and so that should mean that his hold also on Latin America was just as weak. Okay. And so that's what really kicks the independence movement, the liberation movement in Latin America into high gear. Okay, so there's two names that you need to be familiar with. These are both Creoles. These are European educated military figures. The first is Simon Bolivar, and the second is Jose de San Martin. Okay, and they both play a role in leading forces against, those forces that are loyal to the crown, and they lead this successful independence movement. Okay, so Simon Bolivar is mostly responsible for liberating Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia. So sort of on the northern portion of South America. Whereas Jose de San Martin, he is more responsible for the liberation of the southern part of South America. So you see Argentina, Chile, and then Peru. Okay, the wars of independence in Brazil, that's a altogether separate conflict. Okay, so these two gentlemen are responsible for the most part in the liberation of South America. Okay, and so you can see on this map here, it does a really good job of showing where those the years in which they were liberated. Okay, but you can see that by 1830, all of South America has gained its independence. Okay. The next area that I want to talk about is Mexico. So that was a separate liberation movement led by Catholic priests, and that's completed in 1821. And then down here in what is today known as Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, their independence is in 1823. Okay, and yeah, once this is completed, oh yeah, I still have to talk to you about Brazil. Okay, so that is something separate. When Napoleon topples the monarch in Portugal, the Brazilian people gain their independence. Okay, so these two maps show the liberation of South America, 1790, and then in 1820 when it's mostly been completed. Okay, so what should have happened and what could have happened is the continental powers, the Council of Europe, could have acted. They could have responded by saying, hey, there's unrest here. We need to use the principle of intervention to go back in there and reestablish the rightful rulers. Okay, that didn't happen. Okay, the British were unwilling to do so. Okay, they said that they didn't want to get in the affairs of these countries, but really or these former colonies, but really what they were after was their own self-interest. Okay, and they were interested in establishing trade and opening up trade with these South American territories. And so they were unwilling to go to reestablish the control. All right. And really, with them being the strongest naval power, it was kind of going to be up to them to help with the principle of intervention, but they weren't willing to do so. So the United States decides that they're going to, and they're a young nation, but they're going to sort of protect these countries. They're going to guarantee their freedom and their independence. Okay, and so this is what leads to is known as the Monroe Doctrine. So President Monroe says to the European countries, stay out. No more European interference in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, now most of the European countries wouldn't have listened to the United States. Historians think that they wouldn't have honored that. But since there had been an alliance between the United States and Great Britain, it was really going to be Great Britain's Navy that was going to ensure the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so they get credit as well. Okay, so that's the Monroe Doctrine. The next and final topic that I want to discuss in this video is the abolition of slavery in Europe and then in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so there were a lot of ideas about the equality of man and the idea that if we look at John Locke, who is an Enlightenment figure, and the idea that men or humans are born with natural rights, right? Life, liberty, and property, and that they can't have those taken away from them arbitrarily. So one's liberty is, that's an Enlightenment ideal, and that should fly in the face of slavery. Well, it took a while because these countries were very involved. Well, many of the countries, especially Great Britain, were very much involved in the slave trade. Okay. So the British, probably were responsible for the transportation of, 4 to 5 million slaves over the years, over the centuries. Okay. And they had a lot of islands at this time, even, colonies in the Caribbean. So there was an abolitionist movement, and that is a group of people who were, yes, they were enlightened, but they were also deeply religious, okay? And so this weighed heavily on them. They thought that this was a moral failing for their country. So these abolitionists are people who wanted to abolish slavery, okay? And so this movement gains steam, okay? And then eventually in 1807, England becomes the first country, Great Britain becomes the first country to abolish the slave trade. Okay, so no more slavery. None of the thousands of ships or hundreds of ships that are that are being used as slave ships can do that any longer. Okay, the slavery, though, in British colonies in the Caribbean, that's going to continue for another 20 years or so. So it's not until the 1830s that Great Britain then bans and slavery altogether, and then there's the liberation of those slaves in those colonial islands. But Great Britain is the first to do that, and then other European countries follow suit. Okay. Also, want to talk about slavery ending in the United States. Okay, so in that period, where there were abolitionists in Great Britain, there were also abolitionists in especially the North, in the northern states, and they had religious convictions as well, okay, and saw it as a sin, as a grave sin, and a blot against the United States. And so I don't want to spend too much time because this isn't really the purview of this course to discuss the Civil War, but the Southern economy was sustained by, well, at least the plantations were sustained by slave labor, and so they seceded from the Union before there could be an outright ban on slavery. And so President Lincoln fights a war to restore the Union, and then towards the end of the war, the primary focus to continue the war is to also not just restore the Union, but to end slavery. So with the completion of the Civil War, we see the eradication of slavery in the United States. And then slavery is abolished elsewhere. And then the last country in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, that abolishes slavery is Brazil in 1888. Okay. So if you take a look at this map here, you can see where slavery was first eradicated, and then, how other countries followed suit. Um, but what's fairly disturbing is that here, late in the 20th century, we still see slavery hanging on in large parts of the world. Okay, and even today, I mean, we could talk about that at length. The slave trade still exists in certain parts of the world, so that is unfortunately a sad reality. But yeah, thanks for watching this video. We'll catch you next time.